What happens when three privileged thugs brutally attack a vulnerable homeless girl just because she dared to protect a lone, injured old man? They thought they were untouchable. They had no idea the man bleeding on the pavement was a Hell's Angel, and his 500 brothers were already on their way. The damp chill of a Seattle November has a way of sinking straight into your bones, bypassing the flesh entirely. For 19-year-old Chloe Adams, that cold was a constant, unforgiving companion. Chloe wasn't on the streets by choice. She was a ghost in the city's margins, having fled a highly abusive foster home in Portland 2 years prior. She possessed no grand dreams of saving the world. Her daily ambitions were strictly limited to finding a dry piece of cardboard, avoiding the roaming predators of the night, and securing at least one hot meal a day. She had set up her meager camp in a dead-end alleyway just off Yesler Way, hidden behind a towering green dumpster that shielded her from the biting wind coming off Puget Sound. It was a Tuesday evening, the sky a bruised purple, when the routine of Chloe's invisible life was shattered by a sound she would never forget: the heavy, syncopated, mechanical death rattle of a vintage motorcycle. Arthur Rusty Hayes was not a man who blended into the scenery. At 68 years old, he was a mountain of a man, clad in worn, heavy denim and a leather vest that bore the iconic winged death's head patch of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, complete with the Washington bottom rocker. Rusty had been riding with the club for over 4 decades. He was a Vietnam veteran, a grandfather of 3, and a man who commanded immediate respect in any room he entered. But tonight, Rusty was just a frustrated old man stranded in the rain. He was riding his absolute pride and joy, a custom 1947 Harley-Davidson Knucklehead, back from a solo visit to a fellow brother's gravesite. The rest of his chapter, bolstered by hundreds of visiting members from California, Nevada, and British Columbia for a massive West Coast memorial run, were miles away at the Ballard Clubhouse. Rusty had wanted a moment of quiet reflection. He got a snapped throttle cable instead. The ancient Harley sputtered, coughed loudly, and died right at the mouth of Chloe's alley. Hidden behind her dumpster, Chloe watched as the giant of a man wrestled the heavy machine up onto its kickstand. He let out a string of colorful curses that echoed off the brick walls, pulling off his heavy leather gloves and digging into a saddlebag for tools. Under the flickering amber glow of a single street lamp, Chloe could see the deep lines of weather and age carved into his face. He looked dangerous, yet strangely vulnerable as he massaged his left knee, a joint that had been shattered in Da Nang and never quite healed right. For 20 minutes, it was just the two of them in the alley. The gruff biker cursing at his carburetor, and the homeless girl watching in absolute silence. At one point, Rusty paused, wiped grease from his forehead, and looked directly at the gap between the dumpster and the wall. "You can come out, kid." Rusty's voice was like gravel rolling around in a concrete mixer. "I ain't gonna bite, unless you got a spare half-inch wrench in your pocket." Chloe hesitated, pulling her thin, ragged sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders. She stepped out tentatively, her boots scuffing the wet asphalt. Rusty looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the hollow cheeks, the fear in her eyes, the sheer exhaustion radiating off her slight frame. He didn't offer a pitying smile. Men like Rusty didn't do pity. Instead, he reached into his heavy denim jacket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and held it out. "Go get yourself a coffee," he grunted, turning back to his engine. "And a sandwich. You look like a stiff breeze would knock you into the harbor." Chloe stared at the money. It was more than she usually made begging in 3 days. She took it with a trembling hand, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you, sir." "Don't call me sir. I work for a living. Name's Rusty." Before Chloe could introduce herself, the harsh, mocking laughter of young men echoed from the street. Greg Harrison, Donnie Walsh, and Trent Miller were exactly the kind of predators Chloe spent her life hiding from. They were wealthy, entitled university dropouts who spent their parents' money on alcohol, designer clothes, and cruelty. Drunk on cheap whiskey and unearned arrogance, the trio was stumbling down Yesler Way, looking for something or someone to break. They spotted the alley, and more importantly, they spotted Chloe. Well, look what we have here," Greg slurred, his expensive trench coat flapping in the wind. He stepped into the alley, Donnie and Trent flanking him like hyenas. "A little street rat." "Hey, rat, didn't the city say they were going to sweep this garbage up?" Chloe immediately backed up against the cold brick wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She recognized the dangerous glint in Greg's eyes. "Leave me alone," she whispered, her voice cracking. Trent laughed, stepping forward and kicking Chloe's makeshift cardboard shelter, scattering her few possessions into the muddy puddles. "What's the matter? You don't like visitors?" "Hey." The word wasn't loud, but it cut through the alley like a gunshot. The three young men stopped and turned. They had been so focused on Chloe that they completely ignored the man kneeling by the motorcycle in the shadows. Rusty stood up slowly, grabbing a heavy steel wrench from his tool roll. He wiped his hands on a greasy rag, his eyes locked onto Greg. "The lady told you to leave her alone," Rusty said, his tone devoid of anger, entirely calm, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "So, you're going to turn around, walk your preppy asses back to whatever frat house you crawled out of, and we're going to pretend this never happened." Greg puffed out his chest, looking Rusty up and down. He saw an old man with gray hair, a limp, and a broken-down motorcycle. He completely failed to understand the significance of the death's head patch on Rusty's back. "Who the hell are you, Grandpa?" Donnie sneered, stepping aggressively toward the biker. "You her pimp, or do you just like digging through the trash too?" Rusty sighed, a deep, tired sound. "Boy, you are writing checks your body can't cash. Walk away." Instead of walking away, Greg lunged. Greg's punch was wild, fueled by whiskey and misplaced confidence. Rusty easily slipped the punch, stepping inside the younger man's guard, and drove a vicious, short hook into Greg's ribs. The crack of bone was audible. Greg collapsed to the wet pavement, gasping for air like a landed fish. But Rusty was 68, and his bad knee gave out on the pivot. He stumbled against the brick wall, losing his balance. Seeing their leader drop, Donnie and Trent abandoned their mocking bravado. They operated on pure, cowardly adrenaline. Trent grabbed a heavy, discarded piece of metal scaffolding piping from a pile of debris nearby. As Rusty tried to right himself, Trent swung the pipe with all his might, catching the old biker across the back of the skull. Rusty crumpled instantly. He hit the asphalt face first, his heavy leather cut sliding against the rough gravel. A thick, dark pool of blood immediately began to form beneath his gray hair. Chloe screamed. Donnie and Trent descended on the fallen biker, their expensive boots kicking violently into his ribs, his back, his legs. Greg, recovering his breath, staggered to his feet and joined in, enraged by the pain in his side. They were kicking a motionless old man, lost in a savage frenzy. "Think you're tough, old man?" Greg spat, aiming a brutal kick at Rusty's face. "You're nothing. You're trash." Chloe was terrified. Every survival instinct she had honed over the last 2 years screamed at her to run. The alley was open behind her. She could vanish into the Seattle night, and no one would ever find her. The man on the ground was a stranger. He had given her $20, but she owed him nothing. But as Chloe watched the heavy boots slam into the man who had just stood up for her, the only person who had stood up for her in years, something inside her snapped. The fear evaporated, replaced by a desperate, blinding rage. "Stop it," Chloe shrieked. She didn't just yell. She launched her 90-pound frame entirely through the air. She tackled Donnie around the waist, throwing him off balance and sending him crashing into the garbage cans. Greg and Trent turned, shocked by the sudden assault. Chloe didn't try to fight them. She knew she couldn't win. Instead, she threw herself directly over Rusty's bleeding body. She curled into a tight fetal position, wrapping her arms around his head, turning her own frail back into a human shield against the onslaught. "Get off him, you filthy bitch," Greg roared, grabbing her jacket to pull her off. When she refused to budge, anchoring her fingers into Rusty's leather vest, the bullies unleashed their fury on her. The heavy toe of Trent's boot caught Chloe in the ribs. She gasped as white-hot pain flared through her side. Another kick landed on her shoulder, then her thigh. She squeezed her eyes shut, biting her lips so hard she tasted copper. "Just hold on," she told herself. "Just protect his head." Beneath her, Rusty was drifting in and out of consciousness. His vision was swimming, his skull throbbing with a sickening agony. Through the fog of his concussion, he felt the impacts landing on the small body draped over him. He heard Chloe's muffled groans of pain. The realization of what was happening pierced through his haze like a spike of pure adrenaline. This little girl was taking a beating meant for him. Rusty's right arm was trapped beneath him, but his left hand was free. His fingers were numb, but he managed to slide his hand up the inside of his heavy leather vest. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached into the specialized inner pocket where he kept his smartphone. Rusty was old school, but he wasn't stupid. As a senior member of the club, he had his phone programmed for absolute emergencies. With a shaking thumb, he blindly pressed and held the large, tactile button on the side of his phone, a custom speed dial. 5 miles away, inside a sprawling, heavily fortified warehouse in Ballard that served as the local Hells Angels clubhouse, the atmosphere was electric. Over 500 patched members from across the West Coast were drinking, playing pool, and catching up. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, exhaust fumes, and brotherhood. At the center of it all was Big Jim Peterson, the president of the Washington chapter. Jim was a massive, bearded man with eyes like flint. He was in the middle of a story when his phone, sitting on the heavy oak bar, began to vibrate wildly, flashing a stark red skull icon. It was the emergency line, and it was Rusty. Jim silenced the crowd with a single raised hand. The raucous laughter died instantly. When a chapter president raises his hand, you could hear a pin drop among 500 outlaws. Jim answered the phone and put it on speaker, holding it up. "Rusty? Where you at, brother?" There was no immediate answer. Instead, the clubhouse speakers picked up a symphony of pure horror. They heard the sickening thud of a heavy boot striking ribs. They heard the sharp, agonizing cry of a young woman. They heard Greg's cruel, breathless laughter. "Look at this. The street rat thinks she's a hero. Drag them out onto Yesler Way. Let's throw 'em in the street." Jim's blood ran ice cold. Back in the alley, Rusty managed to force a single raspy sentence out of his bloodied lips, right toward the microphone of the phone hidden in his vest. "Yesler, Pioneer Square. They're killing the kid." Then, the phone slipped from his fingers and the line went dead. Inside the Ballard clubhouse, the silence lasted for exactly 2 seconds. Then, absolute pandemonium erupted. "Mount up!" Jim roared, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel roof. "Rusty is down on Yesler. Everybody ride. Now!" The response was a localized earthquake. Chairs were kicked over. Pool cues were dropped. 500 hardened men sprinted for the massive roll-up bay doors. The sound of 500 heavy V-twin engines firing up simultaneously inside an enclosed warehouse was deafening, a concussive shockwave that rattled the windows of every building within a 3-block radius. Back in the alley, the beating continued. Chloe was fading fast. Her vision was spotting with black, and she couldn't feel her left arm anymore. She could hear the bullies panting, exhausted from their own violence. "Roll her off," Donnie gasped, grabbing Chloe by the hair. "I want to finish the old man." As Donnie yanked Chloe backward, exposing Rusty, Greg raised the metal pipe, a malicious grin spreading across his face. But Greg never brought the pipe down. He stopped, freezing in place. The metal pipe hovered in the air. Do you feel that?" Trent asked, his voice suddenly trembling, losing all its drunken bravado. The puddles on the ground were vibrating. Small ripples formed in the muddy water, dancing in erratic circles. Loose pebbles on the asphalt began to jump. It started as a low, distant hum, like thunder rolling over the mountains. But it wasn't thunder. The sound grew, compounding on itself, turning into a deep, guttural roar that seemed to swallow the entire city. The brick walls of the alley vibrated against Chloe's back. Greg dropped the pipe, his eyes wide with a sudden, primal terror. He looked toward the mouth of the alley. The flashing amber street lamp didn't illuminate just one motorcycle anymore. Turning onto Yesler Way, completely blocking off the street from sidewalk to sidewalk, was a wall of chrome, heavy machinery, and furious leather. The headlights pierced the Seattle rain like searchlights. It wasn't the police. It wasn't an ambulance. 500 Hells Angels had arrived, and they were looking for blood. The deafening roar of 500 heavy V-twin engines reverberated off the skyscrapers of downtown Seattle, shaking the very foundations of the historic Pioneer Square district. To Greg, Donnie, and Trent, it sounded like the gates of hell had just been kicked open. The headlights formed a blinding, solid wall of white and amber at the mouth of the alley. For a few agonizing seconds, the engines continued to idle. a mechanical growl that vibrated in the teeth of the three college dropouts. Then, in a terrifyingly synchronized wave, the riders hit their kill switches. The sudden silence was far more oppressive than the noise. It was replaced by the heavy, methodical crunch of leather boots on wet gravel. Dozens of massive men dismounted, their cuts adorned with the infamous winged death's head. They didn't yell. They didn't rush. They moved with the cold, calculated precision of a military unit that had just found the enemy. They formed a tight perimeter, sealing off the alley, the street, and any hope of escape. Big Jim Peterson, the Washington chapter president, parted the sea of leather and denim. He was 6'4" and built like a freight train, his face an unreadable mask of granite. He walked slowly down the alley, his heavy boots splashing in the blood-tinged puddles. Greg's expensive trench coat felt paper-thin as he backed away, his hands trembling violently. The pipe he had dropped rolled harmlessly against a dumpster. Donnie had already fallen to his knees in the mud, openly weeping, while Trent was hyperventilating, his back pressed hard against the brick wall. Jim didn't look at them. He walked straight to the center of the alley, where Rusty lay completely motionless, half covered by Chloe's battered, unconscious body. Jim knelt. He gently placed 2 thick fingers against Rusty's neck. A second later, he let out a slow breath. He was alive. He then checked the pulse of the frail girl draped over his brother. She was breathing, but her face was heavily bruised, her lips split, and her breathing shallow. Jim stood up. When he finally turned his gaze to the 3 young men, the temperature in the alley seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Which one of you swung the pipe?" Jim asked. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a low, resonant rumble that carried perfectly in the damp air. Nobody answered. Donnie was sobbing too hard, and Trent had closed his eyes, praying for a miracle that wasn't coming. Greg, desperately trying to salvage his shattered ego and relying on the only weapon he had ever known, puffed out his chest. "Listen to me," Greg stammered, his voice cracking. "You don't want to do this. You have no idea who I am. My father is Richard Harrison. He's the CEO of Cascade Investments. He owns half the real estate in this city. If you touch us, he will bury your entire club in federal lawsuits. You'll all rot in prison." Jim stared at Greg for a long, silent moment. Then, to Greg's absolute horror, Jim smiled. It was a terrifying, humorless expression. "Cascade Investments," Jim repeated softly. "Yeah, I know Richard Harrison. I know he routes his offshore accounts through a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. A shell corporation set up by a lawyer who just so happens to be on our payroll. I also know your daddy has a fondness for high-stakes, unregulated poker games in Tacoma, games we run." Greg's face drained of whatever color was left. The impenetrable shield of his father's wealth shattered into a million pieces. "Your daddy can't save you," Jim said, stepping forward, his massive shadow completely engulfing Greg. "Because right now, you aren't dealing with lawyers. You're dealing with the Hell's Angels. And you just tried to beat an elder of our charter to death in the street." Jim looked down at the bruised, tiny frame of Chloe. "And worse, you made a civilian child take the beating for him." Jim didn't raise a hand. He didn't have to. He simply took a step back and nodded to the men standing behind him. 10 patched members stepped forward. Among them was Hammer, the chapter's sergeant-at-arms, a man whose rap sheet was as long as his arms. "Wait, please. I'll pay you. We'll pay whatever you want," Greg shrieked as Hammer's massive hand clamped down on his shoulder. "You're going to pay, kid," Hammer growled, dragging Greg toward the back of the alley. "Just not with money." The club didn't kill them. Dead bodies brought federal heat, and Jim was a smart president. But the Hells Angels have a very specific interpretation of street justice. They believe in equivalent exchange. The bullies had used their hands and feet to inflict trauma. Therefore, they would lose the use of those tools. Over the next 5 minutes, the alley echoed with the agonizing sound of snapping bone. The screams were entirely muffled by the roaring engines of a few motorcycles parked at the mouth of the alley, strategically revved to drown out the noise of retribution. Meanwhile, a massive, heavily customized black van pulled up to the curb. Out stepped Doc Avery, a former combat medic who handled the club's off-the-books medical emergencies. He rushed to Rusty and Chloe, stabilizing Rusty's neck and administering oxygen to the unconscious girl. "We need them at Harborview, now," Doc yelled to Jim over the revving engines. "Rusty's got a severe concussion, maybe a skull fracture. The girl has broken ribs and internal bleeding." Jim nodded. "Get them in the van. We're providing the escort." As Doc loaded the two victims, Jim looked back at the alley. Greg, Donnie, and Trent were writhing in the mud. Their hands and kneecaps were meticulously, brutally broken. They would survive, but they would never throw a punch or kick another human being for the rest of their lives. "Let the trash take themselves out," Jim ordered. The Angels mounted their bikes. In unison, 500 engines roared back to life. They formed a massive, impenetrable phalanx around Doc's black van, completely taking over the Seattle streets, running every red light and forcing traffic to a standstill as they escorted their brother and his savior to the hospital. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor was the first thing Chloe registered. She tried to take a deep breath, but a sharp, stabbing pain in her right side stopped her short. She gasped, her eyes flying open to stark fluorescent lights and white ceiling tiles. "Easy, kid. Don't fight the tape. You got 3 cracked ribs." Chloe turned her head slowly. Sitting in a leather recliner beside her hospital bed was Arthur Rusty Hayes. He looked rough. A massive white bandage wrapped around his head. His left eye was swollen completely shut, and his arm was in a sling. But his one good eye was sharp, watching her with intense focus. Panic instantly gripped Chloe's chest. The memory of the alley, the boots, the sheer terror flooded back. She tried to sit up, reaching for the IV line in her arm. Hey, stop," Rusty commanded, his gravelly voice surprisingly gentle. He leaned forward, placing his heavy, calloused hand over hers, stopping her from pulling the needle out. "You're safe. You're at Harborview. It's over." Chloe fell back against the pillows, tears hot and fast welling in her eyes. "Those men." "Dealt with," Rusty stated flatly. The finality in his voice left absolutely no room for follow-up questions. "They won't ever bother you, or anyone else, again." Silence fell over the sterile hospital room for a long moment. Chloe looked at the giant man. "Why are you here? I thought you'd be gone." Rusty let out a dry chuckle that ended in a wince. "Kid, you threw your 90-pound self over a patched Hell's Angel to take a beating meant for him. Do you have any idea what that means to men like me?" Chloe shook her head slightly. I couldn't watch them hurt you anymore. You were the only person who looked at me like a human being in 2 years." Rusty's expression softened, a rare sight for a man who had spent 40 years riding with the world's most notorious motorcycle club. "In our world, loyalty is the only currency that matters. Blood is blood, but shedding yours for a stranger, that's something else entirely. You saved my life in that alley, Chloe." Chloe's eyes widened. "How do you know my name?" The door to the hospital room swung open. Big Jim Peterson walked in, ducking his massive frame through the doorway. He was holding a clipboard and a brown paper bag. "We know everything about you, Chloe Adams," Jim said, walking to the foot of the bed. "We know about the foster home in Portland. We know why you ran, and we know you've been living behind that dumpster for 6 months." Chloe shrank back, feeling completely exposed. "Are you going to send me back?" "Hell no," Jim scoffed, tossing the clipboard onto her bed. "That's the deed to a 1-bedroom apartment in Ballard. Rent is paid up for the next 5 years. And that," he pointed to the brown paper bag, "is a uniform. You start Monday at Ironclad Customs. Our boys need someone to manage the parts inventory and sweep the shop floors. You do good there. Rusty will teach you how to turn a wrench." Chloe stared at the clipboard, her mind unable to process the magnitude of what was happening. I can't take this. I don't have any money to pay you back." Rusty leaned closer, his eye locking onto hers. "You already paid, Chloe. You paid in the alley." He reached into his leather vest and pulled out a small, heavy silver necklace. Hanging from the chain was a medallion bearing the club's insignia, with the words, "Protected by," stamped deeply into the metal. He leaned over and clasped it around her neck. "You wear that," Rusty told her, his voice thick with emotion. "Anyone on the street gives you a hard time. They see that. They walk away. You aren't a ghost anymore. Kid, your family." 6 months later, the damp Seattle chill had finally given way to a warm, vibrant spring. The garage doors of Ironclad Customs were rolled wide open, rock music blaring from the shop speakers. Chloe Adams stood by a hydraulic lift, her hands stained with engine grease, wiping down the chrome exhaust of a custom chopper. She looked entirely different. The hollow, haunted look in her eyes was gone. She had gained weight, her posture was straight, and she carried the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. Across the city, the consequences of the alley had permanently altered the lives of her attackers. Greg Harrison's father, faced with a sudden, mysterious leak of his offshore financial documents to the IRS, had completely cut his son off to save himself. Greg, permanently walking with a cane and unable to use his right hand, was forced to move into a cheap motel, living in the exact poverty he used to mock. Donnie and Trent had vanished from the state, terrified of their own shadows. A loud, familiar rumble interrupted the rock music. Rusty pulled his 1,947 knucklehead, now running perfectly, into the shop. He killed the engine, kicked down the stand, and looked over at Chloe. The bandages were long gone, leaving only a pale scar above his left eye. "Hey, kid," Rusty called out, tossing her a half-inch wrench. "Stop polishing and come help me adjust this carburetor. You're riding with us to the coast this weekend." Chloe caught the wrench effortlessly. She smiled, the heavy silver medallion catching the sunlight as she walked over to the man she now called a father. She had lost everything to the streets, only to find an army of guardians waiting in the shadows. If you love this incredible true story of loyalty, street justice, and finding family in the most unexpected places, make sure to hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your friends to spread this amazing tale. And subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable, true-life drama stories every single week. Drop a comment below on what you think the bullies deserved.